My name is Jared Milford, and Mark, thank you for the introduction earlier today. So nuclear power faces substantial hurdles if it is to be part of the carbon-free energy mix of the future. The long-term challenges of nuclear waste, coupled with serious concerns about nuclear safety, raise urgent questions about continued use of nuclear energy in this nation. But new technology and new policy approaches may hold the answer to these questions. And that's why YCEI is delighted to bring together this panel of distinguished experts to discuss overcoming barriers to a renaissance in nuclear energy. Moderating this panel discussion will be Raluca Scarlett, Assistant Professor of Engineering at University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Department of Nuclear Engineering and Engineering Physics. She's worked on nuclear safety standards for advanced reactor designs and published articles on all aspects of nuclear engineering. Welcome, Raluca, all the panelists, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Jared, for the introductions, and I'll introduce the rest of the panel. Professor Rod Ewing is a professor in earth science at Stanford University and a fellow in nuclear security at CSEC, the Center for International Security and Cooperation, and he's also the chair for the Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board. Dr. Mark Peters is Associate Director of Argonne National Laboratory, just outside Chicago. He's a senior advisor to the DOE and has given expert testimony to the Congress on reprocessing and other aspects of the fuel cycles and non-proliferation. And Mr. Jim Brennan is Senior Vice President of Engineering at Westinghouse Electric Company, which is a large company of 2,000 to 3,000 employees in 8 countries, and supports nuclear fuel and safety analysis and engineering for PWRs, pressurized water reactors, boiling water reactors, as well as development and deployment of new technology. So we'll start this panel with a set of opening remarks from each of the panelists, and we'll continue with a discussion followed by questions from the audience. I believe that there are note cards for questions that have been passed around. So, as an academic trained in nuclear engineering, it's difficult for me to have credibility in the face of nuclear energy skeptics, that I am in fact a nuclear energy skeptic myself. And the skeptics are right to some degree because I've been trained as a nuclear engineer, and so this gives me a certain trust in the nuclear energy community, and with that comes some subjectivity. Nevertheless, I think that nuclear energy and all other technologies should be viewed critically. We should continuously ask what kind of a nuclear renaissance we want. Do we want a nuclear renaissance? Why? And very importantly, technologies should be viewed in context. And what I mean by context has to do with the fact that risk is relative. There are 30,000 car crash fatalities a year in the US. That's about 3 times the population of the Yale campus. And yet we don't stop driving because it's necessary. Or to be more specific, because we consider transportation an important benefit and we don't have other alternatives. It makes no sense to take a risk without a benefit. No matter how small that risk is. And it makes no sense to take a larger risk when lower risk alternatives exist. And so risk is relative. For nuclear energy, the benefit is energy, and the risks and costs fall in many categories. Safety, environmental protection, displacement of communities, social responsibility for the management of spent fuel, non-proliferation, national security, international security, and so on. So let's take these risks and compare them with the energy alternatives. Spent fuel management for fossil fuel. Well, the CO2 is released to the atmosphere. Prompt mortality, and latent mortality due to the coal industry. On some of these criteria, we can make simple judgments, but on some we cannot. We cannot simply sum up the risks for each energy alternative in one single dollar value or in a fatality count as the ultimate metric. Nuclear energy has a complex context, and this is why we have this panel discussion today. Now, in addition to nuclear energy, to nuclear technology being having a very complex context, there are two other features that are unique to nuclear and that make the conversation even more difficult, and that's space and time. So I choose to take the risk of driving a car, and I directly benefit from that risk. I also feel empowered to reduce the risk. I buy a safer car, I drive cautiously, I go to the gym to make up for the impact on my metabolism that sitting in an immobile seat might have on me. And on a routine basis, I forget about the impact of air quality on the houses along the freeways or on the bicyclists that pass by. And so I directly see the benefit, and for some reason or another, I accept the risks. So I feel that I have a choice. Now, with electricity, I don't have an individual choice. The choice is societal. I can't choose to connect to a nuclear power plant while my neighbor connects to a wind farm. Or even if I can, the risks of the nuclear plant still extend to my neighbor. So now, instead of trusting myself, I need to trust society. And this makes the conversation complex. In addition to the complex context and the distribution of risks and benefits over large populations, there is another factor that we need to detangle well in conversations about nuclear, and that is time. When we evaluate the many dimensions of nuclear power, we need to clearly define the time horizon. Spent fuel is a challenge. For which generation? Today, it's an economic challenge. Or, in light of the lessons learned post-Fukushima, a safety concern. In the distant future, it might become an environmental concern. When should this issue be addressed? With timescales of decades, technologies and costs evolve significantly. So the question of how and at what cost and compared to what alternatives has always to come hand in hand with the question of when. So, lastly, I will mention that my research is in the area of advanced nuclear reactors, specifically salt-cooled high-temperature reactors that can run high-efficiency gas turbines, air turbines, that have the capability for power peaking. So in my subjective vision of a nuclear renaissance, we will build a global fleet of such reactors over the next couple of decades, motivated by economics and an urgency to address carbon emissions and growing global energy demands. While we do so, we'll very diligently work on improving safety, because it goes hand in hand with economics. All the nuclear industry is regulated to the same standards. So the inherent safety of salt-cooled reactors make it easier to achieve these standards with simpler and potentially cheaper systems and approaches. We also very diligently work on improved fuel utilization and hence reducing the amount of spent fuel. This doesn't mean that we're putting fuel disposals on the back burner. It just means that we're first addressing the pressing issue of climate change and creating a profitable nuclear industry that can then reinvest in spent fuel management, non-proliferation, safety, and security in the subsequent decades. So I think that, I think of all the complexity of nuclear technologies, and I focus on one dimension: economically competitive energy production that can displace fossil fuel. Because improving one dimension is better than improving none. And I also think of several time horizons, and I focus on a successful present that also supports a successful future. So I'll leave you now with a quote by the poet Gertrude Stein that I often use when I talk about analysis of complex systems. And interestingly enough, this poem was first published in the Yale Poetry Review in 1947. So she says in the conclusion to her poem titled Reflection on the Atomic Bomb, she says, "Everybody gets so much information all day long that they lose their common sense. They listen so much that they forget to be natural." So, Professor Ewing?
How do I? Yep. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. If you don't mind, I'll stand because over the years I've evolved so that I can't speak unless I'm standing. And I'll, thinking about this poem, I'll try, as a neuroscientist, I'll try to be natural and stick with common sense because I'll be taking a very, very simple view of a very complicated question. My first point is that I'm not so interested per se in the future of nuclear energy, which I understand to be the thrust of today's discussion, but rather I'm very interested in understanding to what degree nuclear energy can address the issues of climate change and rising temperature, global temperature. That for me is the key question. I should also mention, and it was mentioned in my introduction, I'm a member of the Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board. And I want to emphasize that none of my comments reflect their views. These are entirely just my personal views. Okay, next slide. I can do it. Okay. Right, so my emphasis is on thinking first about the carbon cycle, and the introductory lecture did a very nice job of introducing the nuclear community and others to this discussion.
Ryan, can we interrupt? Because we won't get the sound right if we don't.
Okay.
Put a mic on you, so we're going to lavalier you.
All right, or I can sit.
That's it.
Just to keep on time. All right, so what I want to do is just say a few things about the carbon cycle, emphasizing points previously made. First, the carbon cycle is complicated, much more complicated than this figure indicates, but you have to realize it varies over spatial and temporal scales. So at a million-year scale, something like the weathering of rock plays an important role in our understanding of how the carbon cycle works. Of course, we're interested in terms of climate change in more recent time periods. Also, I want to emphasize that the amounts of material, gigatons of carbon, are really substantial. If you, in the evening, want to entertain yourself, you can calculate the volumes of materials that we have to dispose of. So when we talk of carbon sequestration, it's startling when you imagine the mountain of materials that we have to dispose of. And also, this large amount is growing rapidly. I use this slide of the carbon cycle from 2002 because at that time, the estimate was a little over 5 gigatons of carbon emitted into the atmosphere. Today, I think it's closer to 8 gigatons plus 10 gigatons, all right? The message here is that while we talk about a nuclear renaissance, while we dream of alternatives, we're losing ground so rapidly that some of the alternatives become less and less attractive. So timely action is essential. And then finally, what we're talking about today is taking a nuclear power plant and replacing the fossil fuel plant, ideally first a coal-powered plant, with a nuclear power plant. But what we have to realize is that when you do that, you're not putting a nuclear power plant in place of this coal power plant. You're bringing the whole nuclear fuel cycle with you, okay? And so a proper analysis, a complete analysis, requires us to look at all aspects of the nuclear fuel cycle in the same way we consider CO2 emissions from burning fossil fuels. We have to consider all of the releases of radioactivity associated with the fuel cycle. Now, this is a simple and typical representation of the fuel cycle. Fuel cycle is a fascinating item because with nuclear reactions, you have the possibility of consuming and creating fissile materials, and so it's beautifully complex. But a point I want to make, particularly in terms of the timeliness of the nuclear solution to at least a part of global warming, is that when we look at the fuel cycle, in the US we don't have all of the elements of the fuel cycle. We have Superfund sites, though, associated with the mining of uranium. We have enrichment facilities. We have fuel fabrication facilities. We have reprocessing or high-level waste from reprocessing from our weapons program. Looking at this diagram, the first thing I want to emphasize is notice there's no geologic repository, okay? This is typical of nuclear thinking, the nuclear community's thinking, and I'm part of that community, about the problem, okay? Geologic disposal, the final site for the spent fuel, is often left until the end of the conversation. Also, when we think of high-level waste from reprocessing from our defense activities, you have to think about the Hanford vitrification plant, okay? Remember, for nuclear, we need a timely response. Okay, so in the year 2000, the contract was led at Hanford for this vitrification plant. The cost was estimated to be about $4.3 billion, and the start date was 2007. In 2006, the contract was renegotiated. The start date would be 2019, and the cost is over $12 billion. This is typical of the fuel cycle. For recycled fuels, MOX, mixed oxide fuel, where we take the plutonium recovered from reprocessing and get it back into the fuel, and then finally reactor. We try to do this in the United States. We have the MOX facility under construction at the Savannah River site. The cost has grown from estimates of about $3 billion to $30 billion. It's fallen behind schedule and so on. For the repository, we can talk about the difficulties with Yucca Mountain, the 30 years of effort and tens of billions of dollars spent. For WHIP, our repository for transuranic waste, we simply note that it's closed because of a release of radioactivity. Very small release, but that release will cause the Department of Energy to spend about $500 million. Okay, 2 minutes. Okay. So when we think about these problems, the thing that's most interesting to me is that nuclear power or any alternative energy resource has to be available in a timely fashion, and timely means over decades, up to 50 years. You can see already some of the delays in facilities in the fuel cycle in the United States. And so what the image, and I'm sorry to use simple cartoons, but that's the way my mind works. We have the carbon cycle for the globe, for our planet, and the question is, how large and what type of nuclear fuel cycle do we need or can we use to impact the carbon cycle? And given the scale and timeliness, that's a challenge. Estimates for increasing nuclear power production range from a factor of 2 to 10. A factor of 2 globally would mean building about 1,000 power plants in the next 50 years. Okay? Does that seem like a reasonable expectation? Because we can't experience what we have experienced in the United States. We can't experience it again. That 20 or 30 or 40 years from now, we're still talking about doing the same things and waiting for the result. Once you tell me what type of fuel cycle you want and how large it will be, then I can talk about nuclear waste problems, which are essentially just looking at geochemical cycles for radioactive elements. And then also I think we have to consider the importance of weapons proliferation. And I would suggest that weapons proliferation is an environmental impact, as important as the mortality associated with burning coal or other fossil fuels. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim Brennan, could...
Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah, the clicker. Thank you. I'll wait for him to pull up my slides there.
And I don't know how to get out. Oh, okay.
Thanks, Jerry. Well, I'm pleased to be here to discuss this important topic, and I can tell you, fortunately, very fortunately, at 17, I was not operating a nuclear reactor. As you may know, Westinghouse is solely dedicated to the nuclear energy industry. We are committed to providing the existing nuclear fleet with high-quality fuel, maintenance, and engineering services. We are investing in new technologies and services to take plant safety and plant performance to even higher levels. I'd like to talk a little bit about our company. We were founded by George Westinghouse, who did many things, but one of them was work with Nikola Tesla, and pioneered the alternating current technology that electrifies the world today. We have been involved in many firsts within the nuclear energy industry. We developed the first industrial atomic smasher, atom smasher, the world's first nuclear-propelled submarine, the USS Nautilus, and also designed the first commercial pressurized water reactor at Shippingport just outside of Pittsburgh today. At present, we are constructing 8 AP1000 plants. That's our newest plant design. It's a passive plant design. 4 of those are in China, 2 in Georgia, and 2 in South Carolina, and we have plans to build additional units in Asia, Europe, and here in the Western Hemisphere. We're also developing new fuel designs that are accident resistant. Today, 50% of the world's operating nuclear power plants are based on Westinghouse technology. As all of us know, safety is the most significant driving force within our industry. All new nuclear technologies must take safety to a higher level. Along with that, to be competitive, new plant designs must reduce capital costs of the new plants, must reduce operating and maintenance costs. And our belief is that a passive design, such as the AP1000, addresses both of those requirements. It's inherently safe, and by using less equipment and less systems for safety, it reduces capital costs and the long-term maintenance costs. Developing new nuclear technology is a long-term proposition. You must conduct the necessary testing programs, perform intermediate design, meet regulatory licensing requirements, complete the final design, and of course construct the first-of-a-kind plant. Innovation in the nuclear industry does take commitment and it does take perseverance. As an example, I'd like to walk you through the design and licensing process of the AP1000 plant and its predecessor, the AP600. It started in 1985 with an EPRI and DOE program that sponsored light water reactor concepts. After a period of evolution, we were able to submit the AP600 SAR, Safety Analysis Report, to the NRC. 7 years later, in 1999, we received the NRC design certification for the AP600. We modified that design and upgraded the plant to 1,000 megawatts, and in 2005 received the NRC certification for the AP1000. And this year, we will load our first fuel into the Sanmen plant in China. So what does it take to commercialize a nuclear reactor today? Certainly it takes collaboration among many entities. We need the collaboration with our customers. We need to understand what their requirements are and what the market is driving towards. We need a consistent government policy, which has been a challenge. And it must have a solid mission. Our mission for the AP1000 was to build a passive plant that had inherent safety features. You need to understand your licensing path. You need to talk with the NRC. You need to listen to their concerns, and you need to be responsive to the questions that they have. You need to have collaboration within the industry. We worked with many partners here in the US and also in Europe and Asia. You must have cost-sharing agreements, and I spoke of how we worked with EPRI and the DOE. And of course, you have to have public acceptance. So, and that's only driven by a high degree of safety in your plant design. So we are working on additional new technologies and new plant designs that include sodium, high-temperature gas reactors, and fluoride salt designs. We do want to be the first to innovate the next advanced nuclear plant technology. And in closing, we believe nuclear is a vital part of a diverse energy future. Commercialization is a long path. It's one that we understand and we're committed to. We continue to explore new technologies that will help our customers generate cleaner, safer energy for more people and a better planet. The next slide that I have is a time-lapse photography of our plant in China and shows you the construction progress from 2009 through the end of 2014. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Mark Peters.
So good morning. So you're going to have to stare at me. I didn't bring slides because I just want to talk.
Let me turn off the screen.
So just so you have perspective, I guess this is the revenge of the earth scientist. I'm also an earth scientist who is part of a DOE national laboratory system that spends a lot of time thinking about advanced nuclear energy technology from an electricity production perspective, dealing with the fuel cycle, and also thinking about it from a sort of a global non-proliferation perspective. So I'm fortunate enough to manage a large group of people at Argonne who think about that on a daily basis. So just that's the context with which I approach this problem. National labs don't make policy, but we actually spend a lot of time with people who make policy. So that's an interesting place to be in this world, because the nexus between particularly nuclear energy and the nuclear fuel cycle and policy is a really fascinating place. But I want to start with, I would maintain, you should know that going through my comments, that when you look at sort of our energy future, and if we're serious about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, mitigating the effects of climate change, and also serious about energy security from a domestic perspective, and any country if they're serious about energy security. Everybody says this, there's no one option, there's no free lunch. That's a true statement. The quantitative analysis shows that. And I would put to you that nuclear energy needs to be a viable future option if we in the US, and for that matter other countries, are serious about a future where we do address those key challenges. So when I think about the future of nuclear energy, it's partly captured in the title of this panel. There's challenges, 4 or 5 challenges, depending upon how you slice them, that one has to think about. And it's important to know that, yeah, I'm a technologist, I'm here to help. But there's some truth to that. There are advanced R&D and advanced technologies that can be developed that can help to further address some of these key challenges that face nuclear energy in the future. So I'm going to sort of march through those quickly. And then I want to sort of give you a perspective on a roadmap to the future. and what it might look like. So let's start with safety. So we've heard a bit about safety. I also want to make the point that this morning's speaker spoke of 3 Mile Island, then Chernobyl, and then Fukushima. And I'm not an industry person, but I've watched how the industry and NRC in the U.S. have responded to those accidents, how the world has responded to those accidents, for that matter. And there's been, I would say that they've shown the ability to learn from each of those accidents. Different things have resulted. Just for your benefit, after 3 Mile Island, there was the Institute for Nuclear Power Operators that was created, and then after Chernobyl, there was the World Association of Nuclear Operators that was created. Those accidents occurred for different reasons. Fukushima was, of course, for a completely separate reason, and Chairman McFarland will probably speak to the NRC response to Fukushima, et cetera, and what's been the ramifications of Fukushima on the nuclear power industry in the U.S. and worldwide. But there has been responsiveness, and part of that responsiveness has involved the way we operate plants, but also there's been technology that's come to bear, the way we analyze threats to the design basis threats, et cetera, either from natural or man-made threats, but also technology solutions have come to bear to address that. Security, and when I say security, I'll separate security from non-proliferation, although they're linked. I'll talk about non-proliferation in a minute. Security, clearly in a post-9/11 world, the United States in particular responded in a very robust way to thinking about, okay, that really, I think, opened up a whole new set of scenarios when we think about potential threats to something like a nuclear power plant. Economics, I'm not an economist, but a lot of what we're thinking about in terms of, it's particularly when we talk about advanced technologies, whether it be fuel cycle related or an advanced reactor for electricity production, the design features, clearly they have to be robust, safe, secure, efficient, but there's also a lot of research going on, particularly at the national labs, thinking about putting features in place that do all those things but are also more affordable, sort of getting down the cost curve. When you talk about advanced reactors, there's a challenge with making them cost competitive as well as you think about commercialization of those machines down the road. Non-proliferation, it's a very complex subject. It involves technical issues, policy issues, but there's a lot of research and development and technology development that goes on to think about how one could actually safeguard, either through inherent design features or through adding additional sensors and instrumentation, so that one can actually convince yourself that you're actually, as you look at global expansion of nuclear power, that within the framework of monitoring, et cetera, that's required no matter what you do, you can actually set up a robust system that convinces us that we're doing this in a safe and secure manner. And then finally, waste management. Yeah, thanks. Waste management, Rod already talked about that, so I'll skip that. But I want to talk for just a minute about sort of where we are today and where we're headed. And one thing that hasn't come up yet that I think is really important is if you look at projections for the current fleet of nuclear reactors, and if you look at, say, the Energy Information Administration projections on the DOE website, or you look at Nuclear Energy Institute projections, you get out to 2030, 40, the existing fleet, even with life extensions, starts to retire. And depending upon, there's assumptions associated with this, but it's a fairly precipitous decline in nuclear power production. So we really need to start now thinking about what are the options for replacing that? Yeah, renewables need to grow, no doubt, no argument. We need storage and all those things, but I would put to you that that's not going to take up that entire gap. So we need to start now thinking about what the reactors will look like then. You heard a little bit about that from Westinghouse. There's a lot of work that can be done between the universities, is being done between the universities, labs, and industry, and that needs to just be scaled up, in my opinion, and accelerated, because the time scales that we're dealing with to be able to get to that get to those designs that are ready for commercialization are significant, and we need to start now. And there is work going on, but I would argue it needs to be accelerated to address that challenge. And then finally on the fuel cycle, Rod already talked about it. Maybe we can deal with it during the discussion. I sort of talk about it a different way. There's two end members. You either go through what I'll call an open or once through cycle, where you mine uranium, you generate electricity, you take the spent fuel, and you stick it underground in geologic repository. That's the current, to be clear, that is the current policy of the United States. to do that, in fact. You could also go to a closed fuel cycle, end member being you're recycling all the material. You still need a repository, but you're recycling the material. And we can talk maybe about what's going on worldwide in that space. So but the policy enablers are really important to that, but there's a lot of R&D that goes into thinking about how one closes the fuel cycle regardless of option that you choose. So I just want to leave you with the fact that there's this nexus of science, technology, and policy that's so vitally important to thinking about this topic. And we need more people thinking about it from both sides and doing it more in partnership to really push us ahead. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introductions. I want to remind everybody, if you have questions, to write them on note cards. And I'd like to start the discussion with the question of defining nuclear renaissance. So what is nuclear renaissance in your vision, and what timeline does such a nuclear renaissance have? Jim, would you like to start?
Well, I think I know when we talk the nuclear renaissance, I think it certainly involves wide acceptance of deploying additional reactors. It means investment in additional reactors. I think it means that the marketplace is ready to build new nuclear units. Relative to the time frame, I think a few years ago, before gas prices came down and before Fukushima, we believed that we were at the beginning of a nuclear renaissance. There were several plants that were upgrading their units. We had received a number of new plant orders, and then natural gas prices came down. Nuclear power right now, I think if you talk with many of our customers, both in the United States and internationally, that's the competitive nature of the energy industry is very strong, and some of them are struggling. So I think those are all factors that contribute to a nuclear renaissance. We actually believe that we were starting one about 10 years ago, and then some factors came in that really turned that around. So
how would this renaissance be different from 40 years ago when a lot of plants were built?
Well,
or is it a reiteration of 40 years ago?
Well, I don't know if we'll ever get back to where we were 40 years ago, but and certainly there are other alternatives to energy than what there was 40 years ago. I think we do realize that to achieve diverse energy requires more than just nuclear power, but I think nuclear power can play a significant role in it.
So in your vision, the nuclear renaissance is driven by economic competitiveness and demand, market demand.
That's certainly a key aspect to it. I think there also has to be public acceptance. I think there has to be government acceptance, and I think there has to be strong government support and policies to allow a nuclear renaissance to take place.
Mark, what do you think?
I guess at the risk of starting out negative, I don't like the word nuclear renaissance, actually. But I think one thing I would add is we need to think about this globally, right? This isn't just about the United States. I would argue there's a global expansion of nuclear power. It's just not in the United States. China's building them, Westinghouse is very active there. But you're starting to see a lot of countries start to step up and actually start to build, either plan to or already building plants, the UAE, Vietnam, Jordan. So it's different than it was 40 years ago, because you're getting a lot of other countries at the table than were during that original, if you want to call, so-called renaissance. And so to me, it is happening globally. It's just maybe not happening in the U.S., and there's a variety of market reasons and economic reasons for that. But I would argue we have to start building, as I said, we have to start building over the course of decades if we're serious about addressing some of the challenges.
And it's global, being driven by the energy global demand, or are there other factors that come into play at the global scale? I'm
not an expert. I mean, a lot of it's just the let's call it the developing world. I mean, energy is so closely linked to quality of life and economic competitiveness and all that, and you said that yourself, that I think you have to produce a lot of energy, and nuclear is one option. I mean, but in a lot of those countries, they're doing everything they can to generate energy, not just nuclear. In other cases, you know, the UAE makes some very interesting decisions relative to why they go to nuclear. There's specific things they're trying to do with desal, but also protect the oil and gas reserves that they have. So there's different reasons, but the bottom line is it's happening. And I would say from the final thing I would say from the U.S. perspective is we better be at that table, because if we're not at that table from a security non-proliferation perspective, that's a big problem.
And that's a really interesting dimension that comes into play. Rod, do you care to comment on that, or give us your vision of the nuclear renaissance, if you like that term?
So I will just agree with Mark. I don't like that term. I lived through the brief renaissance in, say, around 2005, and what happened then was there was great enthusiasm for all things nuclear. I was a member at that time of the faculty, nuclear engineering faculty at the University of Michigan, and my colleagues were dreaming of a wide variety of advanced reactor technologies, and it was all very exciting, and then it's come to a little bit of an end. But I want to come back to my main point. We don't need a renaissance of nuclear power. We need to reduce CO2 emissions. And so that may mean, in fact, using the technologies we have today, building power plants without the most advanced technologies, but rather power plants that we know work and have been modified in a way, you know, to a certain extent to work a bit better. But the main issue before us is not a renaissance, but to reduce CO2 emissions.
So I'll take a question from the audience. Is there a global policy agency for addressing waste processing, transport, and disposal? Which country is the furthest along in approving a central repository?
So there's really no, is that to me, I guess? Yeah. There's really no global agency, although the IAEA does have activities related to repository characteristics, and in particular to evaluating the safety of repositories over long periods of time. In terms of other countries, I think this is a very important question, because at a fraction of the cost, other countries have moved far ahead of the U.S., not only in terms of developing the technology, licensing the repositories, but also in terms of public acceptance. And I think by and large in the U.S. we've ignored those lessons. So probably Finland will be the first country to have a repository for spent fuel, followed quickly by Sweden. Both have in recent years made major progress in their efforts. France is moving ahead at, I think, commendable rate, and so on.
And how do we decide how urgent this problem is to address? If we look at the urgency of climate change, and we look at the urgency of addressing the management of spent fuel, how do we decide their respective timescales and prioritization?
So the urgency is, in my mind, replacing fossil fuels with other sources of energy. Okay. The urgency related to the accumulating spent fuel in the United States, you can take two very different views. One, following the rulings of the NRC, one can say, well, we can accumulate this fuel on site or at a consolidated site safely over periods of decades to hundreds of years. And so the sense of urgency might be lost in that statement. From my view, there's a real sense of urgency because the failure to solve the problem passes it on to future generations, and I don't think that's correct. But also there's a urgency because many of the decisions we're making today on at reactor sites where we're storing the spent fuel will affect the difficulty of disposing of it longer term. Examples would be how many fuel elements do you put into a dry storage cask? How large is that cask? Can it be transported? Can it be lowered down the shaft of a repository? Do you bolt the dry casks shut so that you can unbolt them and enter it? Or do you weld them shut, condemning you then to a more difficult process of cutting them open? So we're making a lot of decisions today that will have a profound effect on our ability to dispose of the waste or affect the cost of disposing of the waste. So I think there's real urgency in arriving at a solution that we understand and that we can pursue and bring to completion.
So how do we go about comparing the two urgencies? Is there a way to understand? Are there decisions that are being taken with regards to spent nuclear fuel that then have an impact on the rapid expansion of nuclear technology? Mark, do you want to?
So let me make sure. Are there decisions being made today that would affect a nuclear future?
Are there decisions being made today with regards to spent fuel that then in turn affect the nuclear renaissance, the future growth of nuclear?
Well, I
energy?
would say, I mean, let me start by saying what Rod said about intergenerational equity and leaving it for future generations, and also the fact that we're making decisions today with spent fuel and storage that could affect the way we think about disposal. I agree with both those points wholeheartedly. So I guess what I would add is that I think the lack of this is now a U.S. domestic statement, not as Rod said, other countries are on a path. The lack of a coherent path forward on dealing with used fuel in the United States is complicating the conversation about nuclear energy as a future option. And I would argue if you got that and it's going to take a long time to get there. Even if we decide to go build a repository, it's decades. Mm-hmm. So we have to get back on the path of having a coherent policy to start that work over the decades so that we can enable nuclear as a future option, I would argue.
Jim, do you want to comment?
I think it's been well stated. I think when you talk about the expansion of nuclear power, the conversation inevitably does come back to the waste question. So resolving the waste question, I think, restores public confidence in the whole fuel cycle for nuclear. So I think it's a key part that needs to be resolved. I agree with what the other panelists have said.
Okay. So Mark, I want to go back to what you said about policy, and this is a question from the audience. What are the policies that need to be enacted for addressing carbon emissions reduction?
Oh, I'm not. You're not going to get me to go too far with specifics, but to me, there's got to be a global framework to, let's say, manage carbon, price on carbon, whatever you want to say. But we've got to do something that's a global framework. And to me, if we do that, that's the right thing to do. How the U.S. implements that is, I mean, you've got the EPA Clean Power Plant, proposed Clean Power Plant out there now. I'm not going to, it's out there. You had Waxman Markey in the previous Congress that was cap and trade. You could go to tax. There's a lot of different ways to do it. But to me, a quote, price on carbon is really, really important to drive the right behaviors.
And in the realm of nuclear technology, are there nuclear technology specific policies that should be discussed?
Well, how about let's just start with an energy policy. That would be a good start. And then if we have an energy policy in the nuclear space in particular, having a policy related to used fuel management, a coherent policy that we're actually on the path to do something and implement is key.
Raluca, could I just follow up on that quickly because there was another question. What about could there be a policy that helps to standardize new nuclear reactors that are being built in the U.S.? Or is that something that will just happen as a interaction between academia, government, and the private sector?
To standardize new reactors?
To build a more have a more standardized design for new nuclear reactors in the U.S.?
Okay. Well, I think there is a tremendous amount of regulation currently to how reactors need to be built, how they need to be operated. So when you talk about standardization, I do think you need to be a little careful because there are different ideas out there, different thoughts on what is the optimum reactor design. And we're continuing to look at that. When you do build a plant, and this is what we are trying to do, I think one of the mistakes that Westinghouse and maybe other companies made 40 years ago was we started with a standard design, but then due to customer requirements or customer requests, we modified that design. And so you ended up building, in many cases, several first-of-a-kind plants. And it's very difficult from an economic perspective, for the utility to be successful, for the vendor to be successful, if you're building first-of-a-kind plants. So, this time around, we are sticking with the AP1000 design. We are saying this is the plant that we know how to build, we know the technology, it is a safe design. When you start talking about standardizing across, different companies, globally, I think that becomes a larger challenge, very problematic. Not saying it couldn't be done, but that's a significant challenge.
And just so you know, in advanced reactors, the Department of Energy is working with the NRC, with federal funding, to start the development of general design criteria for advanced systems. So looking at sodium fast reactors and high temperature gas reactors. So at least there's a start. It's not sufficient, but it's a start.
Which aims at standardizing the safety review, not the designs themselves.
Well, but the general design criteria will help inform the design process.
Right. And so when you build Westinghouse reactors in various countries, do those reactors look very similar between China and the U.S., for example? And does the local policy of each country affect the way the reactor is built and looks?
I would say it's very difficult to absolutely build the same plant in different countries. There are different requirements in each of the countries, but I would say we are doing a much better job of managing those changes and keeping the base plant design, how the safety systems operated, the same across the, whether it's in China or here in the U.S. It's with different regulatory requirements, with different customer requirements, it's I won't say impossible, but it's very difficult to build the same plant in two different countries. But we are doing a much better job, and we have processes in place to make sure that the design doesn't change unless it's absolutely necessary.
And can you speak to the impact of energy policies in various countries on deploying globally?
Well, I think, and this has been stated before, the lack of a clear energy policy in the U.S. has certainly hurt us. There are other countries that are far ahead of us with understanding how what their energy policy is, what they're committing to. And if you look at France, if you look at China, India is beginning to develop their energy policy. They are far ahead of us.
Mark? Do you want to comment on that question as well?
I don't really have much to add.
No.
Just a brief comment on the issue of policy. Certainly, the lack of an energy policy in the U.S. has crippled all energy source potentials. So that's a problem. But what, for me, would be a great help is if the nuclear community and national labs would look ahead 50 years, and given the carbon cycle and the clock that's ticking, and just tell us what's possible. 50 years from now, how much electricity can be generated by nuclear power, how many plants can be built, and what will be the reduction in CO2 emissions that results. With that information, one could then look at the waste problem, at the proliferation issues, and say, well, that's worth it or not. And so my drum that I keep beating is we're on a pretty tight schedule. We have limited resources. we're already paying quite a lot for our nuclear legacy, if you look at the DOE budget. And so we have to be quick and shrewd in the allocation of resources. And the allocation has to have an impact over the next 50, 60 years.
Switching topics slightly to non-proliferation, does non-proliferation face new challenges, or is it helped by this concept of a nuclear renaissance?
Could I defer to Mark?
I would argue, again, I don't like Renaissance, but global expansion, when you have more and more nations developing nuclear technology for peaceful uses for generating electricity, that does raise the need to deal with the non-proliferation issue as each nation enters into that world. So does it make me nervous? No, but it certainly expands the problem to having to think about just that many more actors. There's policy frameworks in place to deal with that, non-proliferation treaty and other policy frameworks, and I think as long as a nation enters into that and is willing to be transparent, it's something that we can do, and we can do it well, and we can do it securely. But yes, I mean, but that's why the U.S. that gets back to why the United States and other nuclear energy states today need to be involved. It needs to be a global conversation. So I would say it's more policy and less technical that solves the problem. But they have the sovereign right to use it to generate electricity, and so we need to recognize that and work within that framework.
And in a sense, there are two sides to the problem. One is the new entrant countries that are developing new technology that have small fleets, and the other is the growth of fleets in existing countries, and that has to go hand in hand, I presume.
Correct.
Do you think that there's enough cooperation and among the different countries in supporting the new entrants to the nuclear industry?
I would say yes. I mean, with the exception of a few, the new entrants have been are coming to the table cooperatively and having productive discussions. The IAEA the International Atomic Energy Agency has a key role in assuring that, and all the countries support the IAEA. So I would say yes. You could argue, does the IAEA have enough resources? That we could have that discussion, but there's mechanisms, organizations, and policies that exist. So again, with a few exceptions, the new entrants are, I think, from a policy perspective, playing well.
Jim, from the industry perspective, have you looked at deploying AP1000s in new entrant countries?
Absolutely. We're looking across Europe and across Asia. And when you say new entrants, I assume you're talking about emerging type countries.
Right.
And the challenge there is, from an infrastructure standpoint, these are large plants. So do they have the infrastructure from a supply chain, from distribution of electricity? So there are challenges that you have in emerging markets that you don't have in the more developed countries and countries that have existing nuclear capacity. So we're working with those countries, but there are other issues that you need to overcome if you're going to build nuclear in an emerging country.
If I could, that raises. I didn't mention this, but it's important as these emerging countries come into play. They have to develop let's call it the infrastructure to be able to not only build and operate these machines, but also regulate the reactors. And so I don't want to understate the importance of developing that infrastructure.
Could I just comment on the proliferation issue? For me, the challenge is how quickly the international terrain can change. The United States and Russia hold 90% of the fissile material that might find its way into weapons. Today, the relation between the United States and Russia, I would say, is at an all-time low in terms of cooperating on nuclear issues, particularly securing fissile material. As we see nuclear power spread to countries like Vietnam, which have essentially no nuclear infrastructure, one can easily imagine political changes in these countries suddenly changing what was a good idea to being a very bad idea. And so we have to think ahead about these issues.
Can we also take questions through the mic from the audience? Is there a mic?
Actually, wait for the mic.
Yeah, so speaking as a citizen, as we all are concerned about climate change, I mean, I can imagine that we could have a passively safe fission reactor. And given the option of 5 to 10 meters of sea level rise or a nuclear waste dump in my backyard, I could even contemplate nuclear waste dump. But as we read the newspapers and look at what's happening in Iran and other places around the world, and we also contemplate the expansion of nuclear power that's projected to meet the needs of the world in 2100, there's going to be an enormous expansion of nuclear power. That's what we're contemplating. At the same time, a move to breeder reactors that will generate fissile material. And I've seen projections for up to 500,000 SQs. An SQ is what it takes to make a nuclear bomb. So 500,000 SQs in the world to generate 3 terawatts of electricity from nuclear power stations. And that seems to be a really scary prospect. I mean, you could even argue it's kind of suicidal. So of all the issues of fission power, to me, the proliferation in a dangerous world that we live in, if you look in the front pages of the newspaper, that seems to me the biggest obstacle to really having fission shoulder a large fraction of the budget of the energy that the world needs.
Just say that comes from a fusion physicist who will be talking later this afternoon.
Right.
Go ahead.
I guess I would just make the comment just to clarify the current state. There's the machines that are being built are not breeder reactors. Just so everybody's clear on that. There are advanced designs that could breed, but they can also burn. So actually, the designs we're developing in the U.S. are more focused on burning versus breeding. Just to be clear. I mean, I take your point, but I mean, you've got to balance all of these challenges and decide what's the right future. If you all are successful at Princeton and we can have fusion in 50 years, that's fantastic. But this has got to be an option.
But I'd just add to what Mark said, light water reactors around the world are creating 70 to 90 metric tons of plutonium each year.
Right.
It's a lot.
So I think this ties into fuel supply, security of fuel supply in various countries. Perhaps, Jim, you want to comment on fuel supply?
On fuel supply, I think on security of fuel supply, maybe one of the other panelists has more background in that area, fuel supply.
Rod?
So I'll be a geologist for a moment. A few years ago, I asked myself the question, do we have enough uranium? And my answer will fall in the range of the answers given by others. But if globally we increased nuclear power energy production by a factor of 2 or 3, present and very certain expected resources would sustain us for about 100 years.
Well, there's the question of global availability and also the distribution of resources. Do we have a similar political situation as we have with hydrocarbons, where the deposits are concentrated in certain areas, and perhaps in a distant future we can envision some inequities in the fuel supply?
Well, inequity is, in this case, in the eyes of the beholder. In North America, if we include the Canadian deposits, they're substantial for us. The world's major producer at the moment, I think, is Kazakhstan. New developments in technology, mainly in situ leaching, will certainly make lower grade deposits economic in the future. So you know, the major nuclear countries, well, I shouldn't say more, that's speculation. Okay.
We had another question from the audience right here.
What Jim Brennan showed is a timeline for AP1000, and if you start at the conceptual to first fuel load, it's 30 years. Walking through testing, design, licensing, et cetera. Now, let me say that can be accelerated by some amount, some small amount. How can any other technology really contribute to reducing greenhouse gases over the time periods people think it needs to be impacted, other than light water reactors?
Well, Luca, can I suggest you take that question? We're getting to lunch, maybe give a minute.
Yeah, if I can just preface maybe some of what Regis said. You're correct. From 1985 to 2015, you know, that design evolved as we went. Also, in the 80s and 90s, there was not a large demand for new nuclear. So I think that also played a role in the timetable, speaking to how long it will take from a new reactor design to actual fuel load and plant startup. So it is a long process, but I think there are other market factors that added that up to make it 30 years.
So
Regis, can I take the bait? So I think there isn't anyone. There isn't one that can actually do it, right? I mean, you basically said that. I mean, it's too late already for climate change at some level. So light water reactors have to be key for the new builds now. I would maintain that maybe we build light water reactors forever for all intents and purposes, but I would maintain the advanced designs will come into play down the road, but those will be too late to address this urgency for climate change that we're talking about. Immediate urgency.
I think it's also a question of innovation, and is there room for a lot more innovation in nuclear technology, and can we change that timeline? Do the new technologies change that development timeline? Do small modular reactors change that development timeline? Do advanced reactors change that? Perhaps, if we have enough smart people working on it, perhaps that's possible. So I think we need to wrap up. I'll ask each of the panel members to just give us a 1-minute concluding remark on the topic of what actions can the audience take to shape the direction of the nuclear renaissance, of the nuclear technology growth that we see on the horizon. Rod, would you like to start?
Not really. I'd rather be third. But in terms of what the audience can do, and in the vein of today's meeting, I think we need people to look very carefully at the way we evaluate risk and options. Risk isn't only just how many people you kill. There are other parameters. And I think if new minds and approaches could come into play, we could evaluate energy producing systems in terms of environmental impact, a broader set of measures, rather than just saying no one died at 3 Mile Island. You know, I'm not against nuclear, but I can tell you a lot of this bumper sticker phrases, they aren't working any longer. We need a more sophisticated way of making the case.
I agree. I think that we need to continue the conversation in a broader context of all of the parameters involved in the various energy alternatives. And I think that we need to focus a little bit more on what we think should happen and sort of put a concerted effort in that direction, as opposed to what will happen, because there's a lot of uncertainty around what will happen. What is the future of nuclear? Let's not focus on that. Let's focus on what should happen and just put a concerted effort in that direction and making it happen.
Me? More young people coming into fields like nuclear engineering and other areas, engineering and science, that are helping us develop the energy source of the future. We need more and more of that. Also, fresh ideas and enthusiasm at the science policy nexus, I think, is really key. And this institutes like this are that's what this is about. So the universities need to really, I think, step up and develop and be more proactive on that.
I think forums like this are a great benefit to talk about the benefits and the risks of nuclear energy. I think we all have a responsibility to educate ourselves on the different energy mixes and the benefits and the risks, and also educate those that we work with, that we know. There's a lot of still misconceptions. This technology is really a 50-year-old technology, and there's really a lot of misconceptions that still exist about the benefits and the risks of this technology. So education, I think, is a key component.
Thanks so much.